celestial limits of Olympus I fell. Taking the form of the phoenix, I crashed into the earth like a burning meteorite. In my glorious, unstoppable descent, I smashed the highest mountains to dust, vaporized the deep oceans, and scorched the skies in blackness. My very presence on this world is like an endless summer, a drought, a curse. I come heralding.
Excuse me, I have to get a glass of milk. Throat's a bit scratchy. Yeah, not the glorious bird you expected. So today I want to talk about the change the date mantra we heard at the end of January in regards to Australia Day, or Invasion Day as many are calling it.
I'm Chris Flanders here in Melbourne, and they certainly know how to put a march on down here. Thousands have turned up.
In Sydney, the crowds brought with them signs, placards and flags, all adorned with political messages.
Here in Brisbane today, more than 1,000 people have turned out for the city's biggest ever Invasion Day march.
I want to talk about the psychological factors that determine people's decisions on whether they are for moving the date from the 26th or whether they want to keep it. We are, of course, talking about the liberal and conservative minds and how they gauge reality. But let me first start by saying that the adages "only idiots refuse to change their minds" and "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" says more about a person than you realise. Keeping this in mind, labelling Australia Day racist is just as dishonest as saying to Aboriginals, "get over your cultural grievances." They are simplistic arguments which don't take into consideration the power of perception, which is what I will be arguing in this video today. How perception steers us to a subjective truth about an objective reality, which in turn effectively disrupts social cohesion. But let us first start with some historical reference to build the case for why the date has become a hot topic for Australians. News.com.au states, "These days, most people are aware that January 26 commemorates the day the commander of the First Fleet, Captain Arthur Phillip, rowed ashore at Sydney Cove, raised the Union Jack, and proclaimed British sovereignty over part of the continent in 1788. But the naming of Australia Day took almost 150 years, and it was not always held on January 26. Now, the article goes into quite some length discussing the historical progression of Australia Day. To sum it up, however, there were four main phases of Proto-Australia Day, which led to the final date we have now. And they are Foundation Day on the 1st of June 1829, Anniversary Day, which was the 26th of January 1888 for all cities except for Adelaide, Empire Day, the 24th of May 1905, which was to honour Queen Victoria's birthday, and then Australia Day, which was the 30th of July 1915, which was to raise funds for the World War I effort. Now, Australia Day adopted the 26th of January in 1935, which had previously been used for Anniversary Day in 1888. In the 1940s, Australia Day was finally nationalised. The political parties of Australia are predictable as usual. Australia's Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull of the LNP and Labor's opposition leader Bill Shorten both giving their support for Australia Day's current date, with Greens leader Richard Di Natale backing a date change. However, it is three prominent Aboriginal women I want to briefly focus on who have very non-typical opinions that surprised me. Opinions that seemed quite nuanced. Alice Springs councillor Jacinta Price, Labor frontbencher Linda Burney, and Macquarie University professor Bronwyn Carlson, an expert in indigenous studies. Carlson stated in news.com.au that Australia Day has not always been on the 26th of January. It has over the past 100 years been celebrated on various days in various months, so it's not like a long-standing tradition. She said someone made the decision to hold a national celebration on a day that marked the coming of the First Fleet and the dispossession and oppression of indigenous people. This day does not reflect a day that is worthy of celebration even for those on board the First Fleet, who were either British military or prisoners of the Crown, she said. But while Professor Carlson believes the date is problematic, she did not think it was racist. The term racist is one that involves a panic and fuels hatred, she said. The date is problematic. The date isn't racist. Professor Carlson said the problem was many Australians did not have an understanding of the history behind the date. I think people are more concerned with being labelled racist than they are about being fully informed about Australia's colonial history, which is sad, she said. In a contemporary Australia, we see racism manifest when non-Indigenous Australians fail to know Australian history in its entirety. Professor Carlson said the events that followed the arrival of the First Fleet were informed by the idea of race, and therefore the mass murder of Indigenous people during this period of this time was all about race. There is benefit in changing the date because it will signal to Indigenous Australians particularly, but also other Australians, that Australians understand the arrival of the First Fleet and the actions that followed have not been positive for Indigenous peoples, she said. Bernie, the Labor frontbencher, was also interviewed in news.com.au, calling for a separate public holiday for Australia's First Peoples. Acknowledging that the date of Australia Day won't be changing from January 26 anytime soon, she thinks an additional holiday should be added. What I'm advocating, particularly in my own party, is that Australia should have a national public holiday that celebrates, that lifts up, that recognises our First Nations peoples and stories, she told ABC Radio on Wednesday. Lastly, Price, the Alice Springs councillor, argued on SBS that we don't know enough of our history, we don't know enough about the atrocities that took place, and this date signifies to some that this was the beginning of all of that. So the atrocities didn't necessarily take place on this particular day, but definitely followed afterwards. By ignoring this date, we're ignoring the significance of this particular date, and we do need to learn about our country's history in its entirety. All that is really horrible about our history, but all that is really good about our history as well, she said. Miss Price believes that Australia Day should be a day for all Australians to come together, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. I think that if us black fellas and white fellas and us fellas that are mixed up quiet down for a minute and look around us, we'd recognise that we are a multicultural society where people have come from all corners of the world to make this country their home because of what we have to offer. People aren't celebrating the fact that Aboriginal people have suffered. Nowhere do I believe that an Australian is celebrating that fact. They are celebrating the fact that we are an incredible, wonderful nation. We are a nation where we have the oldest living culture, and we also have Western culture living harmoniously, Miss Price said. When asked if her position ignores the violence that followed colonisation, Miss Price argued that celebrating Australia Day on January 26 doesn't take away from the country's forceful settlement. I don't think it ignores the brutality. I think we definitely have to recognise that. I think what is being ignored are the loving relationships between black and white. Again, I think it's important to understand it all, but to celebrate the fact that my mum's Walpiri and my dad's a white man, and I'm a product of reconciliation in this country. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the fact that there was brutality. I'm just celebrating love, and love is love, I'm led to believe. And I think love should conquer, and I believe that there's a lot of it throughout this nation. I believe there's a lot of goodwill towards Aboriginal people, from not only the white community, but also the multicultural community, and that this is what we should be taking advantage of and creating an understanding and hearing the many different voices that are involved. I've never said that we should ignore brutality at all, but understand all of it. I found these three women's responses, two quoted on a conservative news site of all places, very insightful and non-reactionary. Price's argument for love and unity and the remembering of all sides of our history was also an interesting take. I personally am not agreeing or disagreeing with these three Indigenous women, only focusing on their contrasting opinions, which are far more fascinating than white Australian politicians. So, here we see a few ideas. The Australia Day should remain steadfast on the 26th, that the date should be changed, or that there should be an additional date. All these viewpoints on solving the dilemma come from a disposition to change, and seems to be a core function of human reasoning. Change and a resistance to change are qualities of the human brain that has been studied for years by academics, psychologists, and scientists.
Conservatives, in fact, in personality studies, do tend to rate higher in areas of stability, loyalty, not liking change. And if you look at liberals from a personality character standpoint, you're going to find stronger ratings in terms of liking change, wanting to actually base decision-making on new information.
The science behind liberal and conservative thinking comes down to two important frameworks, or as I would like to call them, biological and psychological yardsticks of perceived reality. The first framework, which is biological in nature, was discussed by psychiatrist Dr. Gail Saltz on Big Think. She discussed how the human brain itself is an important infrastructure in determining whether a person would lean more to the left, aka liberal, or to the right, aka conservative, on various issues.
I think what's really fascinating is that there have been a number of recent studies looking at brain structural differences between liberals and conservatives. And what's been found in several studies is that liberals tend to have a larger anterior cingulate gyrus. That is an area that is responsible for taking in new information and that impact of the new information on decision-making or choices. Conservatives tended on the whole to have a larger right amygdala, amygdala being a deeper brain structure that processes more emotional information, specifically fear-based information, so it's really responsible for the flight or fright response. And this isn't everybody, it's not black and white, and of course then, what about all of the people in the middle? But basically, the study showed that if you just based it on brain structural size difference, you could predict who would be a conservative and who would be a liberal with a frequency of 71.6%. When you look at what your parents were in terms of predicting what you might be in terms of conservative versus liberal, that enabled you to predict in studies at a rate of 69.5%. So very close, not quite as good. So the question as to whether you have a brain structure to start with that informs whether you will be a liberal or conservative, or whether the formation of certain thoughts from your parents, for example, shapes your brain structure because the brain is plastic. The most recent study looking at what is going on in the brain in terms of politics predicted with the greatest value being able to identify a conservative versus a liberal, 82.6%. And this was a look at brain activity, which is different. You put someone in a functional MRI, which is different than just taking a picture. It picks up activity in a certain area of the brain, and found that when you have them do a risky behavior and look at their activity in their brain, conservatives were more likely to light up in the fright and flight response area, the amygdala. And liberals were more likely to light up in areas that have to do with social awareness.
These three influences on human perception are complemented by psychologist Jonathan Haid's 5 Foundations of Morality, which he discusses on TED Talks as being derived from anthropology on cultural variation and morality and evolutionary psychology.
First one is harm care. We're all mammals here. We all have a lot of neural and hormonal programming that makes us really bond with others, care for others, feel compassion for others, especially the weak and vulnerable, gives us very strong feelings about those who cause harm. This moral foundation underlies about 70% of the moral statements I've heard here at TED. The second foundation is fairness reciprocity. There's actually ambiguous evidence as to whether you find reciprocity in other animals, but the evidence for people could not be clearer. This Norman Rockwell painting is called The Golden Rule, and we heard about this from Karen Armstrong, of course, as the foundation of so many religions. That second foundation underlies the other 30% of the moral statements I've heard here at TED. Third foundation is in-group loyalty. You do find groups in the animal kingdom, you do find cooperative groups, but these groups are always either very small or they're all siblings. It's only among humans that you find very large groups of people who are able to cooperate, join together into groups, but in this case, groups that are united to fight other groups. This probably comes from our long history of tribal living, of tribal psychology. The fourth foundation is authority respect. Here you see submissive gestures from two members of very closely related species. But authority in humans is not so closely based on power and brutality as it is in other primates. It's based on more voluntary deference and even elements of love at times. The fifth foundation is purity sanctity. This painting is called The Allegory of Chastity, but purity is not just about suppressing female sexuality. It's about any kind of ideology, any kind of idea that tells you that you can attain virtue by controlling what you do with your body, by controlling what you put into your body. And while the political right may moralize sex much more, the political left is really doing a lot of it with food. Food is becoming extremely moralized nowadays, and a lot of it is ideas about purity, about what you're willing to touch or put into your body. I believe these are the 5 best candidates for what's written on the first draft of The Moral Mind. I think this is what we come with, at least a preparedness to learn all of these things. If there really are 5 systems at work in the mind, 5 sources of intuitions and emotions, then we can think of the moral mind as being like one of those audio equalizers that has 5 channels where you can set it to a different setting on every channel. And my colleagues Brian Nozick and Jesse Graham and I made a questionnaire, which we put up on the web at www.yourmorals.org. And so far, 30,000 people have taken this questionnaire, and you can too. Here are the results. Here are the results from about 23,000 American citizens. On the left, I've plotted the scores for liberals. On the right, those for conservatives. In the middle, the moderates. The blue line shows you people's responses on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness. But look at the other 3 lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality, I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a 2-channel or 2-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a 5-foundation or 5-channel morality. We find this in every country we look at. Here's the data for 1,100 Canadians. I'll just flip through a few other slides. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, the East Asia, and South Asia.
To see these foundations graphed across several nations with similar outcomes really puts into perspective what the left and the right value most when expressing their own morality. It is important to understand that Saltz and Haid did not talk about whether change is inherently good or inherently bad, as they were not forwarding, or trying not to, an agenda of how to think, but instead how to understand and even communicate with how the other side thinks. I suggest you watch both videos in full to really understand inherent biases that are both biological and generational, and the importance of both paradigms existing in the world to maintain the scales of social cohesion. From this position of ideological awareness, we can now see how both sides in Australia view the Change the Date movement. As you would assume, Liberals want to change the date due to the violence done upon the native Australian Aboriginals during the landing of the First Fleet in 1788. There is a perception of ancestral shame and desire for modern reconciliation, a way of showing respect to the natives, who have a history deep-rooted in socio-political and cultural injustices. A good example of Liberal support for change comes from the Australian Psychological Society website, which posted this statement a couple of days before Australia Day this year. The Australian Psychological Society, APS, and Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, AIPA, urge all Australians to engage in respectful debate about Australia Day. Both organisations are concerned about the tone of public debate, particularly on social media, saying it is harmful to the social and emotional well-being of Indigenous Australians, who already suffer psychological distress at 3 times the rate of other Australians. The AIPA chair, Tanya Dalton, notes that the heightened emotion around Australia Day debates and says, "Many Australian and Torres Strait Islander people view the date as culturally sensitive, and supports changing the date to one that is more inclusive of all Australians. APS President Anthony Ciccello says the APS strongly supports celebrating our multicultural Australian society while considering the views of Indigenous Australians as the original custodians of the land. Conservatives, however, who are for keeping Australia Day on the 26th, are usually adverse or wary of change and perceive the atrocities of the past as a distant memory, which should have no substantial influence on today's society. The bloodshed between English imperialists and Aboriginals is the past. Conservatives are usually proud of their colonial heritage and traditionalism, even going so far as saying that without colonialism, Australia would not have advanced technologically and socially, having reached its current day comforts. Not wanting change for something that does not negatively impact people in a direct, tangible way, or has no material benefits to the function of the society. A good example of conservative support for not changing the date came from Australian Catholic University lecturer Anthony Dillon, who argued, "I respect people's rights to mourn, and even to claim that Australia Day celebrations are causing them grief, insult and suffering. However, I question the motives and the sincerity of those claiming to be upset because of the injustices committed in the past by what boils down to what one set of my ancestors did to another set of my ancestors. Why do I not see them upset by the injustices committed by Aboriginal people against other Aboriginal people today? The high rates of violence in the Aboriginal population, particularly against women, are well documented and widely known, yet there is comparatively little outrage. Why? Protesting about the day, I believe, is a smokescreen to obscure the real problems that many Aboriginal Australians face today. In addition to the problem of violence, there is poor healthcare, community dysfunction, unemployment, child neglect, and poor school attendance. These problems will not be solved by changing the date of Australia Day or giving it a new name. For those objecting to Australia Day's celebrations, I encourage you to consider the aforementioned problems and ask yourself, how will changing the name or the date help those who are suffering most? While I see Australia Day as a day of celebration, it is also perfectly legitimate for people to take time to reflect on past injustices associated with the invasion. Australia Day can be a day of remembrance and reflection, as well as celebrations. Aboriginal academic Chelsea Bond writes, "I march in remembrance for those who lost their lives simply defending their own land and people." She does this without bitterness. While some claim to be a day of mourning, for me and for many others, Australia Day is an opportunity to celebrate living in this fantastic country. It does not have to be one or the other. We can reflect on the past with particular attention given to the injustices endured by the Aboriginal people since the invasion, and celebrate what a great country Australia is today. Both the APS Liberal viewpoint and the ACU lecturer's conservative viewpoint both posed emotionally charged arguments. Here we see the importance of symbolism and how it subjectively steers people's opinions. Bernie echoes this, arguing in the ABC's The Hack that Australia Day began as a top-down nation-building exercise, that the empty symbolism argument, which some on the right use to shrug off the left's grievances, is never made about Australia Day. Yet Dillon's argument was one of choosing your own meaning. For him, it symbolised unity. The symbolism in both arguments are framed in a way that suggests that the objective goal is to sustain social cohesion. That social cohesion would be strengthened if change, or the resistance of change, was embraced, and that social cohesion would be eroded if ignored. To argue for or against this date change, evidently relying on one's own perception of reality and perceived moralities, more importantly the concept of change itself and its consequences, thereby place us in a combative state. Two echo chambers buttress against each other, where those on either side of the ideological spectrum cannot persuade the other, or feel empathy. So if we cannot agree because of our psychological makeup and ingrained biases, what can we use as a marker to determine important societal topics like changing dates, or in the example of the United States, whether a statue should be pulled down or not. I would suggest that because the concept of unity is espoused by both sides, the left and the right, it has always been about social cohesion, a common cause or a common good, so to speak, something that can sustain a workable society that has tangible benefits to all its citizens. Well, as close to all as you can get. Pragmatic, objective benefits of social cohesion for the state and its citizens, if this is even possible. In a democracy, a vote on important topics for social cohesion is perhaps the best way to proceed forward, but the merits on both sides must be presented, other than empty adages. So we look towards democracy and public opinion. Bernie argued that changing the date would have to be a decision taken by the whole country, that all states, all premiers would have to agree. So what does the whole country think? A recent poll by the Australia Institute found 56% of respondents didn't mind which day Australia Day was held on, so long as there was a national day of commemoration, while 49% said it shouldn't be on a day that offended Indigenous people. But another poll released by the Institute of Public Affairs found 70% of people surveyed wanted to celebrate on 26 January. Parliament would have to approve a new public holiday though, and it doesn't appear there is enough support for that to happen at this stage. Can we reach this social cohesion with our ingrained perceptions? Is it possible with Australia Day? I believe it is. We, like other Western societies, have our share of nut jobs, but we have a large number of people who do their best for social cohesion. And I'm not politicizing anything or alluding to other topics such as immigration, cultural assimilation, or tolerance. Those topics are for another day. I'm strictly talking about the spirit of working together as a nation for mutual benefits and being decent human beings. But what can we say about the practicality of implementing a shift in the date? Is there some objective hurdles we must consider? Well, there are some if you consider introducing an additional day and not simply moving the date. Financial losses to the private sector to pay more public holiday, perhaps? Or what about the inconveniences of the government sector and its fluidity when public servants have to take that day off? If we are talking about moving the date, then we can simply look at the Queen's birthday, which is considered a public holiday in Australia. It is usually different in each state and has moved to different dates over time. Because of the ambiguity of the Queen's birthday date, it wouldn't be imprudent to suggest that simply moving the date would not have drastic effects. Additionally, if the date fell on July 30, close to the end of the financial year with all those tax return coffers overflowing, the private sector might possibly benefit from another public holiday spending binge, much akin to Christmas or Boxing Day, perhaps. So I've laid out the moral mind and the biological influences on our perceived reality and shown you both sides of the argument. Evidently, there is a focus on change and how it is rationalised and prioritised by both liberal and conservative, left and right. When we can get a meta view of the human condition and why we continue to war against each other over statues and dates, we start to understand why we perceive issues in certain ways. There is a weight of subjectivity to the whole debate of Australia Day, whether we like it or not. And from this, subjectivity shapes an emotional response towards an objective truth. That the 26th of January is simply just a day. Whilst this window of time does not objectively hold any significance to our biological survival, it does affect our emotional and cultural identity, which in turn helps us identify who we are and how we interact with others in this world. I feel that a way to synergize both camps would be to create an additional day, perhaps the 30th of July as it originally was. And for those who wish to continue to celebrate the 26th, have a moment of silence perhaps, like Anzac Day, to show respect to the violence against the traditional landowners. Then people can celebrate reconciliation however they please. Have a barbie, have a few mates over, listen to Triple J, Triple M. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a sensitive topic. I'm a sucker for additional public holidays anyway. So what does this say about me? Politically, I fall somewhere on the left, though I strive to be a centrist in understanding all things. I won't go into specifics in this video, however, I do see the benefits of the right, and that it is detrimental to society to exist without the scales of liberal and conservatives counterbalancing socio-economic issues. That statement I just made is relevant to my video, as it shows my own biases of wanting change for, as I see it, the greater good of my society. But is the greater good merely a buzzword, beholden to subjective morality? I attempted to seek an objective decision, however, in the end, I feel it has left me with more questions than answers. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a middle finger down. Leave a comment in the comment section below, and please subscribe.
Once you see that liberals and conservatives both have something to contribute, that they form a balance on change versus stability, then I think the way is open to step outside the moral matrix. This is the great insight that all the Asian religions have attained. Think about yin and yang. Yin and yang aren't enemies. Yin and yang don't hate each other. Yin and yang are both necessary, like night and day, for the functioning of the world.
Part of what's difficult in terms of what I'm seeing now is that actually people are tending to double down on their own style and what appeals to their own group of thinkers. And that is increasingly preventing the kind of communication that would be important to our future, so that we can't, so to speak, cross the aisle, because it would require trying on for size the thought pattern of the other group.
You can't just go charging in, saying you're wrong and I'm right, because as we just heard, everybody thinks they are right. A lot of the problems we have to solve are problems that require us to change other people. And if you want to change other people, a much better way to do it is to first understand who we are, understand our moral psychology, understand that we all think we're right. Step out of the moral matrix, just try to see it as a struggle playing out in which everybody does think they're right, and everybody at least has some reasons. Even if you disagree with them, everybody has some reasons for what they're doing. Step out, and if you do that, that's the essential move to cultivate moral humility, to get yourself out of this self-righteousness, which is the normal human condition.